Welcome to the 5th Tapestry Education Conference. We always include in the title Reflecting On, and for this event we're inviting you to reflect on continuing professional development, what it means to you and your colleagues and why it's so important both in terms of your working life and career, but more importantly the role CPD plays in outcomes for children. Leaders should ensure that they and practitioners receive focused and highly effective professional development. And it's important to consider how effectively senior leaders use supervisions and performance management alongside their assessment of strengths and areas for improvement within the setting to provide a focus for professional development activities rather than offering random courses or events for their staff to attend. The essence of CPD is around achieving the highest professionalism in everything we do. Of course, we need leaders and managers to ensure teachers and practitioners have access to the high quality CPD, but we should also, in my view, expect those working in early years to be proactive learners in their own right, to take responsibility for their own professional development from the start of their career and throughout their whole working lives. It never stops, and it should never stop. It's a personal commitment to continuously updating knowledge and skills. We cannot leave our professional development to others and have to take responsibility for it ourselves. Reflecting on our own current skills, knowledge and attitudes is an ongoing critical aspect of our work in the early years. And many of us seek guidance, information and inspiration from a multitude of resources. A respected consultant, for example, or recommended books and articles, webinars and podcasts, work shadowing a colleague, observing and listening to other educators, e-learning or face-to-face learning opportunities like coaching and mentoring. Reflecting on your own needs alongside a trusted colleague, mentor or leader will ensure that your learning journey is stimulating and fulfilling. As early years educators, we make a significant contribution to the lives of children, their families and the wider society. But our knowledge and skills don't come easily. It takes time and effort, continual effort, to be the best we can be. This conference is designed to help you reflect on your own CPD and the learning opportunities within your team. The fact that you're here today is a clear example of that commitment to hear what respected experts in their field have to say, to think about their ideas, theories and practical advice, and to reflect on those, identifying which parts you agree with and perhaps which ones you don't, and how you might use any of this information in your future work. CPD requires self-reflection, curiosity and critical inquiry, and we really welcome you here today. I'm going to hand over to my colleagues in the education team here at Tapestry, Jules Mickelburgh and Stephen Kilgour.
Thank you, Helen. We're delighted to be here and take part in this important conversation about CPD in the early years. I'm Jules. I'm part of the education team here at the FSF and Tapestry, and I'm the content editor for our websites. I've been a teacher in nurseries, reception and Key Stage 1.
Hi, I'm Stephen. I'm an SEND advisor at Tapestry in the Foundation Stage Forum. Previously, I was a deputy head teacher in a specialist school, and I've taught in early years, Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 in mainstream schools as well as specialist schools.
So first, just a couple of practical things. If you would like to see a captioned version, you can enable it from the live transcript option at the bottom of your Zoom window, and a recording of the event and the speakers' presentations will be available on our website afterwards.
Also, you're very welcome to type in questions during the speakers' presentations. You'll only be able to see your own question, so don't worry if you can't see others, but we will be receiving them all and we will be collating them to ask the speakers at the end of their presentations. Finally, if you're going to be posting on social media this evening about the talks, please include the hashtag Tapestry Talks so that we can see the posts and we can collate them afterwards. So Jules, just before we go to our first speaker, I wondered what your personal experience of CPD had been, because I imagine there's going to be comparisons for some of our audience this evening.
Yes, probably. My experience of CPD has been mixed. Some of it had a real impact on my pedagogy and the children I worked with, and some much less so. And reflecting on that, that was probably down to a few things. For example, how much input did I have in what CPD I was receiving? Did it speak to gaps I had in my own knowledge? And was it relevant to the children and families I was working with at the time? And also, did I take responsibility for critical thinking about the training I was receiving? Was I engaged? Was I confident to ask questions? And then did I have time for that follow through? So that reflective practice, embedding in practice, sharing with my team. And I know from experience that can be particularly challenging when you're in a really busy setting or school and you're right in the thick of it. Sometimes CPD may not always seem like a priority. And I was really interested to see that this embedding of CPD in practice was one of the key points to come out of the Education Endowment Fund's recent research into quality CPD for primary educators. Actually, along with taking into consideration the context and needs of the school, and also that the responsibility for quality CPD lies with the providers of that training and the seekers of that training. But Stephen, you were in a leadership role, and I wonder how that shaped your experience of CPD.
Yeah, I think on reflection, there were times when I was involved in the leadership of CPD where the waters were slightly muddied between professional development and performance management, to be honest, and that wasn't ideal on reflection. I'm reading a book at the minute by Zoe and Mark Enser where they advocate really using the word learning as opposed to development, and I quite like that idea because it sort of gives a bit of empowerment to the individual to consider that this is actually their learning and it's not necessarily being put upon them. I think back to much earlier in my career when I was a younger teacher, and I don't think I always necessarily valued the CPD I was offered or was sent on, and I think I sometimes thought it was a bit of a chore, to be honest, when I had to set up the classroom the night before and write pages of plans for a supply teacher I'd never met maybe, or only to come back 2 days later and perhaps find a fairly chaotic scene. So I think, being completely frank, when I was in the classroom, that was sometimes my own experience.
I know I also learned a lot from everybody around me. And Stephen, you and I were reminded of a podcast that we did with Kerry Payne, where Kerry said that one of the most powerful forms of CPD is a curious conversation. And that feels like a really good moment to say that we hope that this event will prompt many curious conversations for everybody watching and listening, and that we're delighted to welcome our first speaker this evening, Iram Siraj.
Thank you very much. Have I got the share screen now? Sorry, I've somehow managed to I think I'm getting there. Can you see the screen now?
Yeah, we just need you to start your presentation.
Okay, great. Do I need to swap screens? Is that okay?
That's the one there. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Jules, and thank you, Stephen. Welcome, everybody. It's fantastic that we have so many early years educators who are willing to come out of their evening and online to think about continuing professional learning and development. And I'd like to thank Tapestry for inviting me to take part in this exciting conference. You have two other really excellent speakers, so I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say as well. I want to talk to you this evening about some research that we undertook on continuing professional development, but we wanted to do it in a way that not only allowed us to make an input to early childhood educators, but gave them some autonomy and responsibility for their own learning as well. We used tools of self-assessment to try and democratise the assessment rather than it just being from outside, it coming from within the centres to improve practice and children's learning. For many years, I felt dissatisfied with some of the professional development I was seeing happening around me, where people were often very, very passionate about things, but sometimes, you know, we questioned the foundations of what they were saying in terms of evidence base and so on. So we embarked on a study in New South Wales in Australia. And my claim to fame is that, you know, we did this study and we did it upside down because it was in Sydney and we were able to carry out this great piece of work. It was funded by the New South Wales government because at the time I was not only working at UCL, I'm at Oxford now, but I also had a secondment to a university near Sydney. So we embarked on looking at an evidence-based professional development intervention. And we wanted this really to see if this worked. So we wanted to evaluate the effects on practices and the programming in early childhood, particularly in the year before children enter primary school. And we designed a strong randomized control trial, which is, you know, often seen by DFEs, educational scientists, as the gold standard for evaluation. And we wanted to know whether, you know, there were short-term outcomes for children on literacy, numeracy, self-regulation, and social development. And our research team, some of which have been cut off at the bottom, included a number of people and not just myself. And I think Ted Meluish, Steve Howard and Mark Tarone have been cut off the slide. Oh, there they are. You can see that it was over a period of 2.5 years that we did the study, but the intervention itself was a smaller period of time where the core PD was given to half of the centres, the staff from the centres, but not to the other half. The other half acted as a control group. The intervention group got the intervention and the control group did not. But the centres, 90 centres, we had 45 in each group, were well matched, and we did environmental ratings, quality ratings in all the centres, all 90, at the beginning and at the end of the intervention. We also assessed children at the beginning and end of the intervention. And the only difference we expect, because the groups were very well matched, we expected to see any differences associated with our training, our education program for the staff. So the study was called FEEL, Fostering Effective Early Learning, and we had direct measures of the difference this learning made to the early childhood playroom environments. And we used the ECA-Z, which was used in EPSI and in a number of other studies, SEED, and we used the Sustained Shared Thinking and Emotional Wellbeing scale as well. And these are scales that measure from 1, inadequate, to 7, excellent, and there is a kind of average and good in between. So we had numerical values on those scales for each of the centres at the beginning and at the end in classrooms that were the year before they entered primary school. The indirect measures were the impact on the children, because obviously the direct measure is on the teachers because they were the ones we were training. So we were looking at the impact on them of their classroom quality. The indirect effect was children's language development, number concepts, but we also had 3 social and behavioural measures as well. So how did we measure quality in those centres? We were focusing particularly on process quality, and the STEW looks at how good the environment and the staff's pedagogy is in building trust, confidence and independence in children, in helping them with their social and emotional well-being, in supporting and extending language and communication and critical thinking, and in assessing learning and language. We also wanted to see how well they facilitated the quality of language and literacy, early number and mathematics, science, environment and diversity. Because in the EPSI study, diversity was very closely associated with the best outcomes. And that doesn't surprise me, because it's the one where people are shown to differentiate and plan for individual needs and groups along the lines of race equality, gender equality, and special needs and additional needs like EAL, which aren't special, but are additional. We used these 2 scales, and we also gave copies of them to the staff so that they could own the assessments themselves and use them. Since then, we have produced one for movement play, because one of the most important things in early continuing professional development colleagues is to ask teachers what they need and what they would like. And when I speak to teachers, I myself trained as an early years teacher and worked in nursery schools, nursery classes, reception and infant schools, as they were called in those days. And what teachers constantly say to me, and have always said, is that they're interested in the whole child, not just the cognitive child and the emotional child, but also the physical child. So we have tried to develop these tools that help to democratise practice for teachers. They get trained on them. We also use them for research, in which case the training is very rigorous. But in terms of practice development, we do it in terms of understanding and self-use as well. And these allow people to assess themselves and their environments and the quality of their teaching, rather than constantly assessing children. And each of these scales has articles that show they have predictive validity, which means they have been shown in research to be linked to improving children's outcomes. Here is one example of the 1 to 7 quality. This is encouraging sustained shared thinking through storytelling, sharing books, singing and rhymes. And inadequate in any playroom would be where there's very little interaction on these and staff involvement is limited to whole group time. Minimum, which is adequate but doesn't really extend children's development, is the staff do respond to children. They locate reading books, sing with them, and engage in appropriate rhyming and wordplay. They invite children to join them. They engage in word and rhyme play. They engage the children in choosing some of the books, and they show they know the children's preferred books. So these are friendly, kind environments, but where the adults haven't necessarily planned for groups or thought through their own role in terms of intentional pedagogy, and where the relational pedagogy is limited to kind of groups rather than individualized. Good is often described as developmentally appropriate practice, where the staff encourage the children to hold and read books or retell familiar stories. Staff use props and puppets where the children themselves can be supported to retell the story, engage with the songs and rhymes, and children are given access to props and supported to retell the stories in free play. And staff sing and engage in rhyming and wordplay while playing and interacting with the children. So here you can see more emphasis on children's agency and autonomy in providing the things that they need to engage with these things themselves, but also the adult has planned to develop children's, for example, phonological awareness and early literacy skills like reading books through pictures and holding books and so on. Excellent would be more aspirational, where staff also use factual books to support children's understanding of concepts. So, for example, if they've been doing the Three Little Pigs, they also look at houses that are made of mud or straw and talk to the children about the strength of houses and the strength of friendships and so on. And staff engage children with stories, they support anticipation of familiar words, and they ask open-ended questions. They encourage children to make links between the story, book, song, rhyme, and their previous experiences. So they individualize and support the children. Here's a slide for you to look at once the PowerPoints go out as PDFs, if you would like a copy. So you don't need to write any of this down because you'll get it all if you want it. So what we did was we did these assessments. We had done these assessments in hundreds of centres in England and in Australia. And we found that there were, the teachers were actually better at language and literacy. They often ended up with 3, 4, 5, not everyone getting really high numbers, but you got the full range starting from about 3 to 6, 7. However, we found very limited understanding beyond 3 for maths and number, for science and the environment, and indeed for diversity. In the STEW, we found most early childhood educators were very good actually at building trust, confidence, independence, and social and emotional well-being. But when we looked at the scores across centres, some did get high scores, so we know the scales work, but the majority, when you average, say, over 457 centres, they were weak on supporting and extending language and communication, weak on supporting learning and critical thinking and assessing learning and language. So what did we do? We devised a professional development based on that evidence. In those classrooms, because of the scales that we have, we picked up that we needed to support staff to engage in high quality interactions and sustain shared thinking and offer them education which enhance their learning in these areas, to encourage more talk and language and early literacy in the home as well as the preschool. And we needed a bigger emphasis on self-regulation and school readiness, or what we called life readiness, because we think the school readiness term is a bit of a nonsense. It's, being ready for life. Concept development, especially in maths and science, most staff finished by giving children activities and experiences, but not help scaffolding, extending their thinking in terms of concept development with, say, something like floating and sinking, or why chocolate melts when you heat it, and so on. We found a poverty of pedagogical leadership in the majority of centres, and we found that there were rarely tools for reflection and trial and error. There were the things like NQS, which is like their Ofsted, and those sorts of standards, but those often raised people to a 3 or 4 if they were quite low. But quite often, if they ended up with a 3 or 4, they got exceeding, which is their equivalent of outstanding in Ofsted. And actually, they were only in the middle of our scale. They were not in the area of quality that extends to children's adding value to their development. So we looked at the research on continuing professional development, which said that half-day workshops, one-day conferences weren't as effective as having something like 45 to 68 hours of training that was spread over a period of time with a specific focus. So we turned our training into 3 phases. The first was too intensive, face-to-face trainings where we gave this sort of input on introducing quality measures, helping people to understand intentional and relational pedagogy and the role of the adult in fostering learning and how you extend thinking and so on. Then we had 2 5 half-day workshops of 4 hours with a break that focused on things like self-regulation, that focused on early literacy, early maths, and all in relation to effective pedagogy in home learning environment and so on. The third phase was an online support. And we laminated a piece of paper which actually identified what we in the Leadership for Learning intervention wanted for their own learning, the professionals' own learning, and then what we wanted for their peer learning. So what would they go and do in their centre with the teachers in their classroom or the other educators in their classroom, and then the children's learning. They had to bring this with them every time we had a training to keep focused on what the aims of the learning were. And here are the results. We have the ECASI, literacy, maths, science, diversity. The red is the intervention group, and we saw only improvements, sometimes quite small, like the one in diversity, because I don't think we focused enough training there. We since then have done training in Victoria, where this has shot up because we put more focus on this area. And actually, you can see in the control group, some aspects have actually got worse, especially in the STEW scale. So that was very good news, that the direct impact on teachers, that they were taking control of their own learning as well as us giving them training. And then when we looked at the effect of the benefit of our training on the teachers that had attended at least 80% of the field intervention, Leadership for Learning, the outcomes on the scales were even higher. And here are the outcomes for the children. Now remember, in Australia, the school year starts in January and ends in December. They have their summer holidays in December and January, part of January. So we started our professional development in February, and it kind of finished in May. So June, July, August, September, before we started, there was like a four-month soak time for the children, with the teachers and the staff having received the PD. And you can see that verbal comprehension, there was a significant effect of the PD. So there was a big improvement in the intervention group. The control group, remember, the classrooms matched each other in terms of teachers, in terms of the areas, deprivation index and so on. There was no significant effect on expressive vocabulary, so we didn't manage to change that. You know, it looks very similar, but we had a significant effect on early number concepts and on early numeracy. So that was very good. 3 out of the 4 outcomes we had improvements on. We also, this is just a summary of what I've just said, but we also had improvements on 2 out of 3 social behavioural outcomes. The 2 that improved were pro-sociability, and that's the child's ability to make friends and, you know, be able to deal with relationships. And the second was reducing internalizing behaviours. So children who came in more anxious, with worried, upset behaviours, the PD helped to reduce that. So what did the intervention actually do? What are the results? What did the educators, the teachers and the educators, because some of them were level 3 educators, some of them were trained teachers, what did they tell us? They said that they felt there was a great deal of personal growth, shifts in their own pedagogy, philosophical and attitudinal shifts. They were more goal-oriented in their practice. It improved their confidence and motivation. I've put a lot of quotes in, but I'm not going to go through them. But I wanted you to be able to see them in the PDF so you could see the strength of feeling some of them had. I remember one person saying to me halfway through the training, why have we never had evidence-based training before? Because I was thinking, I've been an early childhood educator, which is what Australians call themselves, for 23 years. And I was thinking of leaving the profession, but this is really helping me to understand what the purpose of what I'm doing. I can change lives. And this person went on and on and on about this, and we didn't know the answer. We don't know why there isn't more evidence-based training. So things like sustained shared thinking that we talk about came out of the EPSI study as a pedagogy that was linked to better outcomes for children, and open-ended questioning. So we taught these things and they were picking them up. What else? Approaches to sharing of information. Someone might need to tell me when I've got 5 or 10 minutes left. Approaches to sharing of information. Now, this is quite remarkable because 88% of our respondents said they were having more informal daily discussions about children's learning. And quite a large percentage were also using the online platform, where we put all our PowerPoints, videos of our lectures, and even little podcasts of staff meetings that the practitioners had put up themselves. And these were the things that they found helpful. And the changes to practice were things like more reflective practice, improved pedagogy, increase in things like self-regulation and sustained shared thinking, and improvements in planning and use of reflection and planning tools. So these are the kinds of quotes that we got back from, this is an assistant educational leader, assistant director, but she was also the lead teacher in the classroom. And here's another quote, and I've put one in from Cert 3. And this is where I learned something, colleagues. I wanted mainly teachers because I thought you'd need a critical mass of people who had graduate level thinking for the training to be most effective. But the Deputy Secretary in New South Wales said to me, no, you have to include some of the other staff as well, because we have to show a level of equality. And I wasn't convinced that Cert 3s would benefit as much. Well, I was wrong. The evidence we have from the process evaluation is that Cert 3, which is like our level 3 staff, learned as much and they got just as much out of it. So that's been a really important lesson to us as researchers. Here again, we've got more, what was the impact on children? And they told us they were more engaged, they were active problem solvers, they asked more questions, they engaged in sustained shared thinking, they were confident in their interactions. And we said, what was the perceived impact on families? And again, this was a piece of surprise learning for us. You know, with a full intervention only for 4 months, we only expected an impact on the teachers and quality. We didn't even expect that much on child outcomes. We certainly didn't expect an impact on families. Well, we were wrong. Staff told us that there were enhanced connections and increased involvement, that there was increased use of strategies to engage parents in children's learning, and that there was, you know, a third of them, almost a third, felt there was more positive feedback from families. And again, we've got some quotes. ECT means early childhood teacher. And this one was a supervisor as well, telling us what the parents were saying and doing. So what were the main perceived supports and challenges to our practitioners? It's important for us to listen to why they thought things worked or didn't work. And unsurprisingly, the challenges were time, difficulties accessing things online, the staff management and team characteristics. Sometimes the leadership were not on side and sometimes colleagues weren't. Some resistance, too many people as part-time workers, and sometimes they mentioned the children coming with flexible hours was an issue. Some difficulty sharing with staff who didn't attend the PD. We found that if in the centres one person attended, they had slightly lower results than if 2 did, than if 3 did. So that tells us something about having a critical mass in a centre for professional development as well. It's hard to change things on your own when you're the only one that's been for the training. They liked our approachability, professionalism, and passion of facilitators. I'm always cautious about the word passion because I think you can be very passionate about something that's wrong. And I often say Hitler was very passionate, but it has to be backed up by evidence. Passion is a good thing, but there has to be reason as well. And having additional staff attend, access to the scales and tools, they love the use of the democratising of their own assessment and their ability to change their practice themselves in discussion with their colleagues. And the inclusion of illustrative practice. I learned something here as well. I thought our videos were pretty great. And I remember one member of staff saying, it's not just the videos, it's the way you all deconstruct them for us. That really helps. And people seem to agree with that, which was interesting because it's no good just putting videos up online. There's got to be the talking through and the discussion. Supportive staff and so on. So here's another quote by an early childhood teacher. Okay, and then considerations and implications. We've almost finished, and if there are questions, although I seem to have left my phone in the other room, which I'm supposed to look at to find the questions, so maybe they'll have to be put into the chat. I'm sorry about that, Jules. Individual versus room centre. Leadership for learning model of influence. So we focused on the rooms being improved rather than just the individual having the learning experience. So we did ask staff to extend to the rest of their colleagues in a particular playroom. Some took it much further. If they were high up in the leadership, they wanted the whole centre to benefit from it. And when I got back to the UK, I had several emails from centres that said, please, please come and evaluate us now. We've really got the hang of things now. When you came at the end of the year, we weren't half as good as we are now. And some of them showed us how their inspection ratings had gone up as well. So structural supports, people really valued the quality and pedagogy and environment quality descriptions and planning tools. We also had reflection tools for them where they had to kind of plan, do and review, but we gave them advice on how that could be done, and they then became masters themselves at it and showed each other how they were doing it so well. Evidence-based practices where the PD provides clear links between practices and child outcomes. And we showed it's very important in the professional development that there's fidelity and effectiveness linked to the capability, credibility and knowledge of those delivering the PD. It was easier for us because we'd done the research that we were basing our PD on, and we had linked it to other researches. In fact, the first phase of this study was doing an international review of PD, of what works, and which meant we weren't uncritical of that literature, but we looked at where the patterns were emerging and tried to model what we knew within that sort of framework. People said that they really felt as learners that they were being professionalized. Now that was interesting because, I thought they were already professionals, but many of them felt that they hadn't been, they've often been given supportive things, but they haven't been treated like professionals in their own right to improve their profession. I'd like to explore that more with any future groups that we work with, and we've got studies going on in the UK, in China, and various other places now, and still stuff going on in Australia, where I'd like to explore that with people much more. And structure that allows for reflective practice during the PD. At the beginning of every workshop, we really went through how things had gone in their centres during the 2 or 3 weeks that they'd been trialling things. Enhanced knowledge of child development. This was interesting because we felt, because we had found things like science and maths concept development wasn't very strong, that maybe people didn't understand concept development in children. And we did explain that and illustrate it for people. And they found that really very interesting because we also did open-ended work like what is concept development. We got very, very different bits of information from people. So it was good for them to have and develop their own working knowledge of child development and what self-regulation does for children, or what scientific thinking or high quality interactions do for them. And we also did one session on leadership, how to be a leader in learning in your own playroom, your own classroom, in the outdoors. And of course, the inherent challenge is always our time and support from the team management. And one of the things I'm going to do next year is a project on creating a play scale, play standing for pedagogical leadership in the early years. It will be partly linked to all the studies we've done and what we've learned from that in terms of the kind of pedagogical leadership support we want, because it seems to be the missing link. But when things don't go well, it's usually because there's been a lack of support in terms of leadership. Staff resistance and leadership indifference, and the challenge of being a pedagogical leader. That is, I came into early years to work with children, and suddenly here I am, and you're saying, you've got a responsibility to work with other adults in a very professional way. You have a responsibility to work with parents in the home learning environment in a professional way. And our teachers managed to achieve that beautifully. But they wanted to talk about it. They wanted to know why these challenges had not been addressed before, and they were kind of expected to do it, but hadn't really had sufficient training. So thank you. I'm going to end there. How might research like this support your policy development and current early years agenda for professional learning? What questions would you like the professional development and learning and associated research to consider? What would you like people like me to do more of? And can any of this assist your plans for workforce development? Thank you very much for listening. Should I go and get my phone now, or?
You're okay, Iram, to be honest, as long as
right.
you're happy. We've got time for a couple of questions, I think, but thank you so much for that presentation.
I hope I haven't gone over my time.
No, you're absolutely fine. And we've got a couple of minutes to ask a couple of questions that have come in, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
So the first question that I have for you is, in your experience, how accurate are settings in evaluating their own practice using the scales that you've referred to?
Well, I've been using these some of these scales since we had the centres of excellence and then the development of the children's centres. And when Margaret Hodge got us to evaluate some of the centres of excellence, I started using them as self-assessment tools in the late noughties. And I was fascinated at how much stricter they were on themselves than I would have been. But there's a balance to be struck. They are using these tools in centres in Australia, the biggest provider of early years Good Start that has 700 centres and 15,000 staff, are now using them. And, Sue Robb is the practice coordinator there, and I've trained up some of the people there who act as mentors and coaches. So they train their local people, be it in New South Wales or Victoria or South Australia. Then they go in and say to them, which areas do you want to work on? Look at and they then use the rating with them and look for evidence of what they've found, what they haven't. And they feel they're very honest about their shortcomings. And then what's fascinating, Stephen, is that they work with them to develop short, medium, long-term aims, but largely short and medium aims, and then give them 90 days to improve. And then the mentor goes back and works with them. It's not like a test. And they have done another review, and the mentor does an independent one as well. This is their critical friend. Now, I was quite shocked and unbelieving of what they'd done to begin with, because in some centres, in a year, you saw we had improvements of 1 point or 1 and a bit. But with this, where you democratise the assessment and trust the teachers and educators, they're getting improvements of 2, 3, 4 points within months. Some centres are better than others. Some centres have got challenges and hardly make any improvements because they've got so many part-time staff or shortage of staff or a change of leadership. So it's not true across the board, but many that are working on this, and they're working with 30 or 50 centres at a time, are using it very, very well. If we trust professionals, they do a really great job.
Okay, thank you. Iram, are you okay to just stop your screen share, please? So we can...
Yes, of course. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope there was at least something in it that was worthwhile, and have a lovely evening. And thank you, Jules and Stephen.
Thank you very much, Iram. We really appreciate it. Okay, so next up, it's time for our next speaker, and we're really delighted to be able to introduce Annie Richardson. Hi, Annie.
Hello.
I'll let you introduce yourself properly.
Okay, my love, thank you. I'm just going to try and share my screen, which worked before. Let's have a look. Okay, can you see that? Hello?
Not as yet, Annie. No.
Let me do that. Let me try again. It worked in practice now, didn't it, Steve?
It did, yes. You're not fibbing.
Let me do that. Okay, let's try that again then. How about this? And share.
Oh, something's happening.
Does that look right?
Yeah, you just need to start your slideshow.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, let's go backwards. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that now, yeah? Hi, I feel very humbled actually in talking to you all this evening, especially after such a hero of ours, that is Iram. So it's just me now. So I'm Annie Richardson, and as my biography, if you've read it, explains, I've worked in early childhood sector for in a variety of roles for over 30 years. And I'm now a lecturer in early childhood education and care at University of Brighton. My real current interests, I suppose, are learners in educational settings who support Black children, because that's a real passion of mine, but that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm always like to emphasize that I'm not the expert when I talk to practitioners working in the field, as many of you will be. You're the experts in the children and the families that you support, and I really see myself as a co-constructor of learning and development, and someone who helps those people I work with to put theory to practice. I like to be a provoker, really, and ask questions to enable practitioners to reflect and position themselves, and really through that articulate their values and beliefs and why they do what they do. My talk today, and I'm in between two fab people, contains very few references to literature, mostly because I want this space to be a space of reflection today, which is a real passion of mine and those in the early years team that I work with. I've recently written a few articles which have emphasised the power of reflection and reflexivity, and I also write a blog in which I reflect quite a lot, called A Little Voice in a Noisy World. And if you want to have a look at any of those, then please do look at the references slide at the end. So what are we going to do together? And it is our time together. And I would like some sort of feeling that you're part of this journey with me tonight. So we're going to be thinking about personal pedagogy and how this relates to continuing professional development, and how to approach that continuing professional development with some questions in mind. So I'm going to give you lots of provocations, because that's me, in the form of questions to you today. So there are going to be probably more questions than answers, but that's because I really want you to think about the question right at the top of your screen, at the top of this slide, which says, what's worth standing up for? I think sometimes it's really hard for us to engage in critical reflection of our own practice, and it needs bravery to take on board sometimes that our practice might need interrogating. I think finding time and space to reflect on what we do is often really hard, especially for those wonderful people working on the ground. Sometimes we might have mentors or coaches in the workplace, or we might come across people who are offering us CPD who might challenge our ways of practicing, or our views of ourselves, or our ways of being, or our values and beliefs. And I think at times that can be hard when we're exhausted to recognise that what is being challenged isn't necessarily a criticism of us, but a call to look from a different perspective, perhaps. And today, so I will be trying to encourage you to reflect on your own pedagogy and what from that is worth fighting for. So what is meant by pedagogy? You know, we fling this word into the ether quite a lot. And this, for me, is one of my favourite definitions of pedagogy, which comes from Stewart and Pugh in the old National Strategies document, which some of you might remember, called Learning, Playing and Interacting. So what it says is pedagogy is the understanding of how children learn and develop, and the practices through which we can enhance that process. It is rooted in values and beliefs about what we want for children, and importantly for me, supported by knowledge, theory and experience. That document then goes on to say that the more we are aware of our practices, what we do, why we do it, its impact on children and their learning, and the more we reflect, learn and develop our practice, the more effective we will be. And this is developing our pedagogy. Now, I think there are some really crucial ideas here to enable us to develop as professionals in early childhood and be recognised in society for the professionals that we are. We have to be proactive in deciding what we want for our babies, toddlers and young children, as well as their families. And I feel sometimes like too long we've been dictated to by policy and reacted to sort of what is passed down through the ideology of those people who have more power than we do. And I think in terms of pedagogy and policy, we often need to make decisions about what we would not let go of despite that policy. And I'm going to sort of talk about that a bit more in a minute. And what I really want to remind you of again is that question that I said before, what's worth standing up for? So over the years, I've come to realise that in my early career, I was often led by policy, and this dictated my practice in a pack-away playgroup and later a daycare centre that I worked with. And sometimes that felt wrong, and sometimes it jarred with my sense of what was right for children and families, but I didn't have the bravery or the time or maybe the confidence sometimes to challenge that. When I later became a consultant for a local authority, we were given sort of particular areas to focus on when we visited settings or when we delivered training. And that was quite often passed down to us from National Strategies Department. There were times, I have to say, when those agendas didn't fit my personal pedagogy or even at times challenged my own morals and ethics. I think I was quite lucky then. I don't know whether people are still as lucky in working in local authorities, but I had some freedom in designing my training or my interaction with settings. And so when I visited, I would quite often just get them to be critical themselves in applying what could be quite a prescribed approach. And this was a small way of me subverting what I didn't feel was in the best interests of young children and families. Don't get me wrong, I didn't encourage disobeying the EYFS and its statutory element, but I did make suggestions about how things might be applied more flexibly where it was possible. I think that when we attend any sort of CPD, we need to think carefully about how it fits with our pedagogy. Remember, our pedagogy is ours. After all, we own our own thinking. However, this right to our own thinking also comes with a responsibility to continually re-look at it rather than assume ours is the only way, or that everyone thinks and feels the same about early childhood that we do. So somebody called Gay, who writes about reflection, talks about the fact that we should not accept taken for granted values, professional understandings or practices, but use reflection in order to keep our practice alive. So what I'm going to encourage you to do today is to take down your pedagogy from the shelf, give it a dust off and a good spring clean. However, it doesn't really stop there. We might have an idea of our individual pedagogy, and hopefully it should then align to the overall vision or pedagogical approach within our setting. When these are in opposition, though, it can make for a very unhappy working environment. And thinking about this, I want you to think about now how much you've had these sorts of conversations in your workplace. Can you see where your personal values and beliefs marry with your setting's ethos? In terms of the current EYFS and obviously the regulatory body, which is Ofsted, I feel like we're sort of in a unique position of deciding how we translate our pedagogical approach into a curriculum for our settings that we believe is the right curriculum for the children and families we support. There's enough flexibility within that. The problem comes, though, when those sort of pedagogical beliefs are at odds with the policy from those with the power above us. So I'm just going to bring up the wonderful Nathan Archer's work. He recently wrote in the latest early education journal about sort of ideas of strengthening professional identity. And something that comes across really strongly in his article is the importance of agency, being the ability to act independently and make our own choices. And his idea explores the fact that in order to strengthen our professional selves, we need critical awareness. And this critical awareness means asking ourselves sometimes difficult questions about policies, about procedures, about approaches, but not just about those, but also thinking about whose interests those policies, approaches, practices, whose interests do they serve, really? And sometimes what can happen is that these difficult questions might lead us to having to exercise our professional agency to resist the policy or approach. And this requires us to have confidence in our professional decision. And that really, for me, resonated with some of the things that Iram was saying in her presentation. We have to be able to make professional decisions, but those professional decisions need to be based on our informed knowledge. And by informed, I mean that it should be informed by both experience, but also things like literature and research and that evidence base that Iram was talking about. But that's not easy, I think. And we also have to show bravery about standing behind the decisions that we make. Sometimes we might have to demonstrate a level of compliance to policy. And here comes me as my provoking self. We should also think about that sometimes we have to subvert what we are told we have to do in order that it fits in with our beliefs, as in that example I gave where I was a consultant going into settings, that sometimes we have to subvert things slightly in order that it still fits with what we believe is good and true and correct for our babies, toddlers and young children. So the quote that Nathan uses to explain ideas of ethical subversion are shown on the slide, and I'll give you a few minutes to read that. So let me read it. So I think for me, this idea of ethical subversion is that if you have your pedagogy strong and true in front of you, which can be flexible to an extent, you also have to think about what is it that you won't let go? What is it that you hold as good and true, as I said, and what is it that is worth fighting for? So this sort of fits really well with what I want to talk to you today about, because engaging in CPD requires that critical awareness to consider every time we're sitting listening to someone in front of us that is training us or whatever, to think about how that aligns with our personal pedagogy and also how it relates to the ethos in our settings. If there's a disconnect between something that appears in policy and what you hold, as I said, dear and true, how will you demonstrate professional confidence and bravery, as Nathan shows on his diagram there, in order to stay true to your personal and pedagogical values, and thereby enact self and collective efficacy through your practice? So how are you going to translate what you're hearing, what you believe is true, into a policy where there might be little wiggle room? I recently listened to Kerry Payne's interview for the Foundation Stage Forum, which Jules mentioned earlier. And Kerry said something really similar that really resonated for me. And so we can reject ideas from CPD if they don't fit with our pedagogy. And I think that's really important. We have to be critical. We have to be people that think rather than just take it all in. Something I always say to my students is, I'm not here to open up your head, put in stuff that I want you to know and then close it down again. I want you to think. I want you to be thinkers. So as part of the talking about students, the final module on the full-time early childhood module that I teach on, so it's a final year, and at the end of that year we ask a number of questions in order for them to be able to articulate their pedagogy at the end of their 3 years of study and their placement experiences. And on the slide are some examples of the sorts of questions that I set them. I'm going to give you, I probably can't give you 5 minutes, so I'll give you a few minutes to have a look at one of those questions. Choose one, and I want you to answer that question. If you've got pen and paper, then write down your thoughts, but choose one of those bubbles and think about, okay, what do I really believe about this? Okay, that's probably only been a couple of minutes, but I'm really conscious of the time. So I'm gonna ask you to sort of begin to finish off your a couple of points. I'll give you another few seconds if that's okay. It's always difficult on screen to get a sense of when people are finished. Okay, so now hopefully you've got some ideas about it. Why do you think this? What's influenced your thoughts? Again, I'm going to give you just a minute really to think about that. Why do you think that what you've written is correct, or is, you know, what's the underpinning thought behind that? What's influenced that? So depending on where you are in your career, probably you will have very different answers about your explanation about why you think these things are really important. But for me, these why questions, this what questions, are a crucial part of the process of professionalism in early childhood education and care. If I think back to my early career, if I was asked this why question, I'd probably make some reference to what I had seen in my practice. It would have been very limited to what I had experienced with the children and families I worked with. I would have witnessed practice from the role models that were my colleagues. However, that would have been a very inward gaze and quite a narrow gaze as well, because I only had my own sort of little narrow setting. It was a small setting to think about. It wasn't my fault because it was all that I knew, and I'd only experienced one way. I never really thought about the fact that there were other approaches to what I had in my practice. And I would never have thought that there might have been different ways of helping children and families than the wonderful work that was being done by the colleagues that I was working with. But as I gained more experience, I felt confident enough to start a diploma in play group practice. And then it encouraged me to consider child development more, for example, and in much more detail, how that impacted on the environment that I offered. I was introduced to some theory, which was eye-opening to me, because suddenly I thought, okay, there are reasons that I do what I do that I'd never really thought about. As part of that course, I was also encouraged to go out and visit other settings, and I was able to witness different approaches, which was absolutely wonderful, because suddenly you get this idea, well, I could tweak what I'm doing with this by doing something very similar to what they're doing. So I think my confidence in that why question expanded as I gained experience. But it was only done because I was brave enough really to go into that sort of continuing professional development. I don't know about you, but I become a bit of a CPD junkie in that I craved it. That once I got going on that I was almost like a collector of certificates. However, I'm ashamed to say that there came a point down the years when at times I just rolled my eyes at attending CPD that didn't seem to add anything new to my knowledge or experience or practice. And I was the practitioner in the room who would roll their eyes or yawn at the content. But one day when I was sitting next to a very dear person who later became a mentor to me, when I expressed my thoughts that I had heard the trainer's content 100 times, she urged me that rather than close my mind, I had to open it to think about how the message from the trainer either affirmed or disputed my own beliefs and what I could take from that. That really stayed with me and changed my approach to attending CPD, and that I had control over what I took through my attendance if I came to it with an open and critical mind. I think it's about being active rather than passive recipients of CPD, because if you attend with a closed mind, perhaps because you're being made to, and I've been made to attend a lot of training, if you're not engaged in the room, how can you ever really learn, not just from the person at the front, but also from those around you? And again, I think what Iram talked about really emphasizes the fact that the learning happens in a room, not just with the trainer, but also with those around. The power of attending CPD is that it has the potential to offer a different view and a different perspective if you sort of open your mind to that. So as we progress our careers, our pedagogy should evolve, and our pedagogical beliefs are likely to shift as we experience more in terms of practice and our observations of children and families, but also hopefully as we read of that new research, new theories, new approaches, as we attend CPD, which might shift our ideas of best practice that we hold in our own settings. We can attend CPD, as I did in my early career, and believe me, I really did collect those certificates like badges of honour, or we can fully engage in CPD by being active participants both during but also after the event. So I'm just going to finish it up now, really, by thinking about putting the C into CPD, which was the title, which at the time I thought was very clever. I'm not so sure now. But my first C is that we need to think about continuing. And I know that it already stands for continuing professional development, but we can also think about it in terms of continuing to build our own pedagogy and sort of committing to never stop learning, and having that open mind and open heart, really. Continuing to share ideas from CPD with colleagues to grow their pedagogy too, so that, again, as I think Iram said, that it's a community of change, a community of thinking about pedagogy, reflecting on what our setting and our children and families need. Continuing to reflect on how any adjustments in our pedagogy marries with the ethos and the setting, because sometimes I think we don't look at both at the same time. We might have an ethos, but sometimes that shifts too. So again, I think it's really crucial that we're thinking about pedagogy and our setting ethos in tandem. Oh, let's go like that. Continuing to have that open mind, as I've said, open to those new ideas, open to new approaches, prepared to listen to all members of the setting. I think one of my biggest upsets sometimes is when I'm working with work-based students and they go out of my session enthused, and they've learned something which they feel their setting doesn't know particularly, and then they return the following week a little bit tired and a little bit jaded, because what's happened is they've gone into the setting and it's thrown out as, we've tried that before and it doesn't work, without real discussion. So again, use staff to feed in that enthusiasm, because I feel that's really important. See, as in critical. So when we're engaging in that critical, in that CPD, think about asking yourselves critical questions. That doesn't mean criticizing yourselves, but that does mean being active rather than passive. Sometimes I feel that the delivery of a trainer can influence how we take CPD. So a really persuasive speaker can convince you of an idea through their passion, and a less charismatic speaker can make you switch off. It's important to try to be objective, despite how someone may bore or excite you through their delivery, and instead try and get down to the core content of what they're trying to give us. And I think, as Iram said, what's the evidence base for these ideas? Is this reliable? So making sure that you're thinking, okay, where does the evidence for this sit? Who's going to benefit? Who will benefit if I bring this to my setting and make changes? And who is this sort of CPD for? Is it for, again, those in power to put in some particular policy, or is it really going to make a difference for children, families, and our colleagues? And then after I finish this, are there any gaps in my understanding, and what will I do about it? So again, will you go back and talk with other people that have attended it with you? How will you do this? Will you have a staff meeting? Will you all get together? So it's really important, I think, sometimes that we have those conversations after the event, when our sort of passion might have waned slightly. Considered, that's my next C. How do these ideas connect to policy within my setting, in the local authority, or from the local authority or the government? So again, think about, what are the musts? What can't I shift from? And then, is there wriggle room for me to maybe translate things more flexibly? Do these ideas marry with my own pedagogy? If not, should I or could I engage in that sort of ethical subversion? And again, thinking about what's worth standing up for. And that leads to the last point. How much power do we have to enable change to happen? It's no good banging your head against a brick wall if it's something that you're not going to be able to shift. But again, where is that middle ground, so we don't have to compromise fully on what we believe in? My last one is connecting. And so we're nearly there. I hope I'm not too over time. How do these ideas connect with my own on this topic? So again, thinking about pedagogy, thinking about values, thinking about beliefs, how much do these, again, throw up these critical questions for me? We have to dust off and spring clean our views and beliefs at times, I think, rather than sit and carry on with the same old. What do others think about the topic? How can I connect with other people about this to gauge other people's opinions? And that might be the online forums. Twitter's my favourite, local early years network groups, or perhaps simply a cuppa with colleagues. But how are you going to connect with other people about this? And then, of course, do I feel strongly enough about these ideas to act? And have I got power enough to do that? Who will I need to connect with? You need to seek those that make you stronger. Wider sector issues need a joined up voice. Look for communities that work for that united voice. And as I said, together we're stronger. So that's nearly me done. Next time you attend CPD, try and put the C into CPD. I feel very strongly that we must own our own pedagogy, but we must be able to articulate it and be prepared to fight for the parts of it that we can't compromise on. I think we've suffered a bit from passivity in the early childhood sector. Sometimes it's forced onto us from a society that doesn't always understand our sector or the children and families that use our services. There are many other issues which have perhaps influenced why the sector still suffers from those with power dictating practices which we know aren't appropriate. I know we're all exhausted too, and it can be really hard to muster up the energy to be enthusiastic about these things when energy is depleted. I just want to really finish with the wonderful Suzanne Zedek, who recently spoke out on Twitter in response to the possibility of ratios being changed again for babies in early childhood settings. What she tweeted was a message which I think we must all listen to. You either use energy to do the right thing and feel the fear, or you use energy being afraid and colluding. So I think we need to feel the fear, and rather than be passive in what is fed to us, we've got to be much more active, because we can't complain about things being done to us unless we act to enable change, and it starts with us. So thank you to everybody for listening, but most of all, thank you to all those wonderful people in the sector who've tirelessly worked to make a positive difference in the lives of our youngest members of society and their family. You've really been awe-inspiring, and I've been absolutely bowled over by my students who are working and how hard they've worked. I know that people are tired and life is really difficult currently, but I ask that we all stand up to make our voices heard and feel the fear and do it anyway. Thank you. And there's my slides.
Thank you so much, Annie. We're going to crack on straight away with the first question. It's quite a long one, but it all hangs together. So does a settings pedagogy need to be recorded anywhere? Is it in fact something that can be expressed easily in words? Is there a danger of it being reduced to a policy, put on the shelf and rarely considered?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think much like having a vision when you're trying to implement change, we have to have something that we hold up that's almost permanent in terms of something to work towards. This is us, this is what we believe. I think it should be constructed with everybody. I think that's really important. And it should never be just there and always there. It needs to be dusted and taken off the shelf. And I think, again, we're at a wonderful time in terms of looking at our own curriculums with the new EYFS to really think about, does this still do what we want it to do? Yeah, hopefully that answers that one.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. I think we've got time for one more question to squeeze in. There has been quite a few, but the second question is, how can senior leadership teams ensure that all staff feel comfortable to approach them with critical reflections on the provision?
Oh, I think it's up to those senior leaders, and I think it depends very much on your style of leadership. But I think it's about making those spaces, about maybe instilling that as the ethos of your setting, almost, that actually we value all voices, whether they are from the babies in our setting, the families, or our colleagues. I think, it is about working together. Sorry, there's a cat trying to get in. So yeah, I think it's about an ethos, and I think it's about working together. And sometimes it's about senior leaders maybe seeking support in how to be much more collegial in their leadership. And I've suffered a lot from that myself, where sometimes it feels like things are done to us rather than with us. So yeah, I think it's about that ethos that you grow.
Thank you, Annie. That's been fantastic, and thank you for joining us this evening. We will see you again soon, I hope.
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody for having me. All right, take care. Bye. I'm still here. I'm listening to the next one.
And now it's time for us to welcome our final speaker, Emily Lees. Thank you, Emily.
Hi guys, just let me know if my microphone isn't working. I'm just going to get up my 1 second. Just have to navigate this. Hang on. Okay. Sorry guys, my executive functioning, I need to understand, I need to remember what order to do these things in. Right. Portion screen. Right, sorry about that. Right, okay, so welcome everyone. My name's Emily Lees and I'm a speech and language therapist in Greater Manchester. Today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of combating ableism in your practice when you're supporting neurodivergent children. So this is going to be a very brief whistle-stop tour on neurodiversity, and what I hope for today is that I can at least get the conversations going around how to reflect on your practice when it comes to these issues. And you might hear things today that completely challenge what you've been taught about autism, which I'll be talking about a lot. And if you find yourself getting resistant or uncomfortable, that's okay. This is how we change and develop our practice. And it's a process that we all go through, including me, because I was once practicing in ways which I didn't even realise were ableist. So as Annie has explained beautifully tonight, what's worth standing up for? So things to know about me. I am autistic. So whenever I deliver presentations and talks, I always speak from my own lived experience in addition to my clinical expertise. Now, I was diagnosed as autistic as an adult early this year at the grand age of 33. And like many undiagnosed autistic adults, I was missed as a child at school. So I currently work in a specialist school for autistic children aged 5 to 19, with many of these students coming from mainstream settings after the placements have broken down, and often they've been out of school for long periods of time. So what is neurodiversity? It's a buzzword at the moment, but basically neurodiversity is, in fact, let me go from the historical context. So the term was first introduced by autistic sociologist Judy Singer in the 90s. and she proposed that neurodevelopmental differences were in fact just a natural variation in how people think, feel, and experience the world. So this was a radically different way of viewing neurological differences. So the term neurodiversity is an umbrella term. So it encapsulates all types of brains, which includes neurotypical and neurodivergent. So neurotypical is a brain that follows your typical cognitive, sensory, language development with no neurological differences. And neurodivergent refers to anyone who does not follow that typical development. Common types of neurodivergence are autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia. So it's important to understand that the usage of these terms, there's quite a lot of confusion. So neurodiversity, the term neurodiverse is frequently used in the wrong context. So people often will say autistic people are neurodiverse. Well, this is actually the wrong usage. So we as a human race are all neurodiverse, whether we are neurotypical or not. So when referring to people who are not neurotypical, the correct term is neurodivergent, because we diverge from that typical majority norms. So, for example, you would say autistic people are neurodivergent. And this is why you can't be just a little bit autistic. You either are or you aren't. It's your neurology. So today I'll be talking about neurodivergence in the context of autism, because there's going to be a high proportion of children in your settings that are likely autistic, and the autistic people are often multiply neurodivergent, which means they can have additional differences in attention, cognition, sensory processing, communication. So they can also have ADHD or dyslexia. There you go. And because I'm autistic, I can share some of my experiences, which hopefully will help you contextualize what we're talking about today. Okay, so what is ableism? Ableism is discrimination in favour of people without disabilities. It can take many forms, such as assumptions, attitudes, beliefs, and practices. Ableism is often unintentional and unconscious, whereby we don't even realise that what we're doing could be discriminatory. So in the context of the children you support, here are some common examples of ableism. So a child with ADHD is told off for fidgeting and they have their fidget toy taken away. A child with dysgraphia is told off for messy handwriting. An autistic child who struggles to make eye contact is considered rude. Or this same child with sensitive hearing, they have their ear defenders taken off them so they can get used to the noise. Or a child with Down syndrome is asked to constantly repeat themselves because of their unclear speech, and they're not given an alternative way to communicate, such as Makaton or a speech output device. Privilege. We can't talk about ableism without talking about privilege. There are lots of types of privilege, so financial, race, ethnicity, gender, but there's also neurotypical privilege. And there's a great quote by David Gader that I like, which is, privilege is when you think something isn't a problem because it's not a problem for you. And the thing about privilege is that we all have it, including me. So I'm white, I'm cis, educated, English speaking, able-bodied, so I don't have a physical disability. So for neurotypical educators, you have to recognise your own privilege as a non-neurodivergent person, because you have a lot of power, because you're the ones that are making decisions and not really understanding the experiences of living in a world which isn't set up for you. So, for example, neurotypicals don't have to go through the day being triggered by their environment or being told that you have poor social skills, having to hide your difficulties in order to be socially accepted. But this is the reality of being autistic. And it's also thinking about the terminology that we commonly use and see in education. So special needs, controversial, it's actually quite dehumanizing because it suggests that disabled children somehow have different or additional needs that non-disabled children have, when in fact they all have the same needs. The only reason that the needs are viewed as special is because society is set up to cater for non-disabled children. And the word disabled is okay to use. It's not a dirty word. And I have no issue in saying I'm a disabled autistic woman. We also want to be mindful and careful about making comments about the disabled community that could potentially offend or belittle them, such as, oh, they're so inspiring, and oh, bless them, you know, they're in their own little world, they're so quirky. Again, really condescending, and they're not compliments. So if we think where we are now in terms of models of practice, the medical model of disability has been the dominant model for the past 200 years. So autism was once viewed as a form of schizophrenia. It was also seen as a triad of impairments, and it was once thought that it was caused by a cold and detached mother. So society has always operated from a position of needing to eliminate anything that deviates from the norm. So this is the medical model. It's all about reducing the disorder, condition, symptoms, and it's rooted in there being this one right way to interact in society. So this applies to, you know, oh, that person's normal or not normal, or healthy or unhealthy. A lot of this stuff is based on, you know, standardized assessment scores, IQ tests, which I was given an IQ test in high school to determine which sets I would go in, and I scored an incredibly low IQ, which again is reflective of the spiky profile that I had as an autistic child. So if you don't meet these norms, then there's something wrong with you and you need fixing. And for decades, autistic children have been exposed to interventions and therapies based on neurotypical child development. So cognitive, attention, language development. And this is the ableist society that we live in, because these approaches do not account for children whose differences are in learning and thinking. So these are the children who are frequently taught to look less autistic by being taught to hide their traits, which society deems as socially undesirable. They're frequently described as aloof, rigid, inflexible, on their own agenda, which is my personal favourite. And this is the language that we see in documents, EHCPs, and unfortunately this comes from the diagnostic manual, so the DSM, which uses all these diagnostic checklists for autism. So one of my missions is to educate people and advocate for a change in attitudes in how society views autism as a whole. So we made some significant progress from the medical model, where we saw the social model being introduced in the 70s or 80s. Now, this was a really positive step because it recognised that disabled people were significantly impacted by their environment due to barriers, inaccessibility and exclusion. We saw a greater focus on equality, where each individual or group of people were given the same resources and opportunities. But despite the social model being a vast improvement, in reality, we still see that the dominant model across health, social care and education, it's the medical model. So we see this in mainstream education, whereby disabled neurodivergent children cannot cope in these settings due to the environment not being set up for them. You know, how often do we see children get punished or excluded for breaching behaviour policies? They get sent to behaviour units and then they get sent to specialist schools. And these are the children who are punished for not sitting still in class. They're told off for messy handwriting. They're not allowed to go for movement breaks to self-regulate. And the blame is frequently placed on the child and their family for being challenging and difficult. when what we actually need to do is identify the things in the school environment that's causing them distress. And what I find really interesting is that autistic children are said to have inflexible, rigid thinking, yet it's actually the schools that have inflexible, rigid rules and policies. So, understanding autism, professionals must understand some common misconceptions about autism. So, autism is not a mental health condition or learning disability, but these frequently occur alongside. So autism's been historically described as a disorder or a condition that can be measured. So from high functioning to low functioning, mild, severe, labels, such as Asperger's syndrome. These all originate from the medical model, and they're deeply stigmatizing to autistic people. And what's important to understand about Asperger's is that it's no longer a diagnosis. It's not an official diagnosis, and it's been removed from the DSM. And the reasons for this are that basically the autistic community felt really opposed to this because it separates autistic people into, high and low functioning. And people will then have this association that if you have Asperger's syndrome, then you must have a less severe form of autism. So it's really problematic. So all these labels are very misleading because autistic people's needs fluctuate daily, hourly, weekly. So if you think about the children that you support and how their needs might change through the day, here's an example. So you have a verbal autistic child who loves walking around the classroom. This child's sensory needs mean that they have hypersensitive hearing and they need to wear ear defenders. They're also hypersensitive to touch. So if someone brushes past them, this can feel overwhelming. So here you have a child who doesn't have any obvious language difficulties or motor difficulties. But one day they come into school and they've forgotten their ear defenders. They walk into class and the noise sends them into sensory overload. And then another child will bump into them by accident, and then that escalates the distress even more. So you've gone from potentially viewing this child as high functioning to now they're in the middle of a meltdown, they've lost access to spoken language, and now they might be perceived as low functioning. So this is the problem with labels, because they put people into boxes and dehumanizes people and the needs. So another example is you have a non-speaking child who has significant language difficulties, and they also are dyspraxic. So basically they have coordination difficulties and they may need adults to support them to open doors or go to the toilet. So this child might be perceived as low functioning. However, they don't have the same sensory needs as the other child. And so they might seek noise, they might love banging on drums, and they may actually be undersensitive to touch so that they will seek, being hugged. So you can see just how problematic that these labels can be. And the term low functioning is incredibly dehumanizing because it dismisses the child's voice, it denies their autonomy, it assumes that they can't learn and develop skills, and it dismisses other methods of communicating, such as speech output devices or sign language or alphabet boards. And similarly, being called high functioning. Now, this can stop children being identified at school because they are deemed as not that bad. These are the children who might be quiet, obedient, they do all the work, they don't really have meltdowns in school, but these same children might go home and suddenly have a meltdown because what's actually happened is that they've stored all that energy in their body all day. They've been masking. And so for people who aren't familiar with the term masking, this is when an autistic person essentially puts on a mask and hides their difficulties, because that's what they've been being conditioned to do. So they suppress all that emotion and physical, mental energy. So when a person is described as high functioning, what it actually means is that this person is good at masking, which is why so many adults, including myself, were undiagnosed. And the last one, autistic person or person with autism. Now, we know from the research and by thousands of autistic people that the community generally prefers autistic rather than person with autism. So the way we talk about autism is hugely important because the language we use influences our beliefs. Using autistic makes it clear that autism is an inherent part of that person's identity, which is nothing to be ashamed of. So it's a choice of empowerment from the community. This language is similar in how we might describe someone's identity in relation to their nationality. So for example, you would say English person, not person with English, or you would say gay person, not person with gayness. So the only caveat to this is we always want to go with what the individual person prefers. So when I'm supporting a student, if they prefer has autism or person with autism, then I respect this. But when we speak publicly about autism, we always just want to be safe and go with the majority. So I'm going to talk to you about some common practices that I see. If we think about curriculums that we're taught to follow, there is a lot of ableism that exists. So if we think about the emphasis on improving autistic children's social skills, we see outcomes such as engages positively in play with peers, engages positively with supporting adults, shows evidence of active listening. And these are just some of them, by the way, there are reams and reams. The problem with these outcomes are that they are ableist because they're based on the social skills and cognitive development of neurotypical children. And as a society, as I say, we've been led to believe there is one right way to interact. So say please, thank you, make small talk. There are so many unspoken rules. And if you don't do these things based on politeness, then somehow there's something wrong with you. These outcomes also discount autistic styles of communication and interaction. So we know by the research and by thousands of experiences of autistic people that active listening looks very different in neurodivergent people. For example, autistic people don't have to be looking directly at someone to be absorbing information. We often use our peripheral vision, and even though it might not look as though we're understanding and paying attention, we can be, you know. Whereas for a neurotypical child, they may have to turn their bodies and, you know, do direct gaze to show that they're listening. But this attention difference is frequently misunderstood by educators because they just assume that the autistic child is not paying attention. And when it comes to autistic styles of communication, it's understanding that we have very different ways of communicating that are just as valid and effective as when neurotypicals interact with each other. And this is backed up by research. The other problem with those goals are that they're entirely subjective. So what if the child doesn't want to play with the peers? What if they're boring? What if they don't share their interests? What's wrong in playing by yourself? And what does respond positively even look like? So the double empathy problem proposed by Dr. Damien Milton, he says that neurotypicals have difficulties understanding autistic people. And so it's vice versa, it's a two-way street. And this is that double empathy, because when you have two people with two different neurologies and experiences of the world, they're going to have difficulty understanding each other. However, it's typically the autistic person that's to blame for the misunderstanding. And this has come from the theory of mind research in the 1980s, which has been completely debunked now. But this research went on to cause significant harm to autistic people because it perpetuated that narrative that we're the ones that are unfeeling and that we're the ones that don't have social skills. A common occupational therapy outcome for these children is shows increased tolerance of sensory input. Now, this is massively problematic because desensitization therapy is not effective for autistic people, and it's actually harmful. And the reasons for this are that it's down to neurology, whereby we do not get used to sensory input, which is causing us pain. So you put me in an office at work around talking, printers going off, I'm never ever going to get used to that noise. And this is also backed up by research. So basically, forcing an autistic child to eat a food to which they cannot stand the texture of, they're never going to get used to it. Controlling behaviour through compliance. So the problem that I see with many classroom visuals are that they are demanding, they just give instructions, you know, sit down, stop, quiet. And this is dog training. This is literally how you train dogs. Another one that I see is social stories. So for those who are familiar with social stories, you know, I will listen to my teacher, I will sit still, you know, all that kind of social expectation. So you can see just how problematic these are. And when we're using rewards such as stickers, foods, overusing praise, this is all to just reinforce socially expected behaviours. And I also see a lot of adults will grab the hand of a child to move to an item, or they will move the hand away, or they will move the hand to pick up a visual. This is not neurodiversity affirming, and it actually violates that child's body autonomy. So basically that child learns that anybody can touch the body. So neurodiversity paradigm, neurodiversity model, it's a radically different model whereby it sees autism as a difference, not a disorder. It means accepting differences in neurology and not seeing autism as a condition, but just a different neurology. So it's not about fixing, it's not about curing, not about treating. It's addressing the ableism and privilege. And just like with the social model, it focuses on changing the environment. So we look at what's causing the child's distress, what things are making them feel so unsafe. Do they need fidget toys? Do they need a weighted blanket? Do they need movement breaks? So what accommodations do they need? The neurodiversity model uses strength-based approaches. So we focus on what the child can do. We want to facilitate their learning and play. We don't want to impose rules on how that child should play or how that child should interact with that toy or object. We are child-led, not child-centered, which what this means is we go with what the child wants to do. So if they have an interest in, I don't know, if they have an interest in like Peppa Pig, use that, just use that and embed it into all the learning activities, because you can do a lot with that. You want to spark their inherent interest. So we call it like intrinsic motivation. We don't want to force activities or interests on them because we deem that as appropriate. We use non-behavioral approaches. So we don't use all that positive reinforcement. We don't train social skills. We encourage harmless stimming. We respond to attempts to communicate in whatever way that is. And we don't force eye contact, because eye contact can be physically painful for autistic people. And this is due to over-arousal in parts of the brain. So basically forcing an autistic person to make eye contact with you, it's ableist and it's harmful. So we don't want to say to the child, like, look at me while I'm talking to you, show me you're listening. We don't want to write play goals, such as engage in 5 times turn taking. We don't give a rigid set of rules during free play, because free play is free play. We don't want to mold or change that. We want to foster these real, genuine relationships. we also must understand sensory processing and the impact it has on the child's mental health. We address sensory sensitivities, we lay aside our judgment, we create a calm environment in order to prevent that child from going into distress. We want to help them co-regulate and not just leave them to calm down, which they often can't do if they're very distressed. And we avoid using deficit-based language. So avoiding things like impairments, challenging behavior. We just want to acknowledge all their unmet needs. And we want to avoid pathologizing neurodivergent children. So where we see the DSM saying repetitive and stereotyped patterns of behavior, it's understanding that actually these are special interests. These are the person's drive to look for sameness and predictability and routine. So there's nothing wrong in that level of sameness and structure every day. So I'm just conscious of the time. So I'll leave this slide for people to look back to, but this basically just summarizes problems with historical autism research. So it talks about the theory of mind, and it talks about limited evidence of social skills training and the female and male autism debate. So you can look at that in your own time. So the last slide then, this is just very brief summary. So if we want to combat ableism in our CPD activity, we must reflect on the sources. So where is it that we're actually going to find this information? So basically courses, so the things on the right that we want to avoid, courses, training and events about autism. So whenever I see a course or event on my Twitter feed, I always ask myself, right, are the majority of the speakers neurotypical? Do they describe themselves as autism experts, which doesn't really exist? Do they actually have any neurodivergent or autistic people speaking? Because these are huge markers of whether this CPD activity is going to be neurodiversity affirming or not. So the phrase "nothing about us without us" really encapsulates this. So we really need autistic disabled people leading these conversations. And just quickly, we also just want to be careful of certain people in the media who are viewed as advocates, because they actually might be perpetuating the wrong narrative. So Temple Grandin, for example, well-known autistic figure. However, she's someone that the community they don't support her because of her stigmatizing comments that she's made. So for example, she once said, young adults with autism need to get their butts out the house and get a job. She also supports functioning labels and once said that vaccines cause autism. And Tony Atwood is another person that the community have spoke out about, because he frequently offends autistic people through mocking them, impersonating them. He's made disparaging comments about trans people, and he still uses a lot of outdated research and terminology by focusing heavily on Asperger's. So I urge you to be cautious about where you get your information from. So to combat all this ableism, we need to flip the narrative about autism and allow autistic people to be who they are and be their authentic selves. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Emily. We have got a few questions and a couple of minutes left. I'll start, if that's okay. So the first question I've got is, acceptable terminology changes perhaps every few years, perhaps over decades. How can we keep up to date with the latest thinking so we can remain respectful to disabled individuals?
Yeah, great question. Because that really shows a willingness to actually want to engage and want to get it right, which is delightful for me. So my answer would be actually what I've just mentioned. So really think about the sources that we're getting this from. So not necessarily the National Autistic Society, because there's some issues there. What we want to do is we want to get our sources from reputable sources. So autistic communities, you know, Twitter is fantastic. So, you know, people like Kieran Rose, the autistic advocate. My brain's gone. I'm not good at being put on the spot, but basically go to the research. So any research you see, you know, from Catherine Crompton, Damien Milton, Sue Fletcher-Watson, like all of these people, don't just Google it and look at the first one, because if you go on Wikipedia, it gives you loads of bad information. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Another question is, when discussing the unique needs of children with their parents, how can we support parents who are struggling to come to terms with the diagnosis of autism for their child?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I think it starts with whoever is having that conversation, I suppose, with that parent, because they are going to be seeking reassurance, information, education through that educator or professional. So it's, I mean, this is why it's really important that professionals get that solid understanding of what neurodiversity affirming practice looks like. So really it needs to come from there. But again, it's there's lots of things online. Like if you go on Kieran Rose, the Autistic Advocate's website, he has lots of resources and groups, and you know, he's sort of good vetted resources that parents can use.
I'm going to try, I know we're 1 minute over, but I'm going to squeeze in the very last one just because I think we can. Are there any resources or reading that you would recommend for a speech therapist looking to embed neurodiversity into assessment and intervention?
Ooh, yeah, there's a lot. I mean, if you go on my website, so autisticSLT.com, there is a page on there called Pro Neurodiversity Model. So I do kind of cover a lot of that. Now, none of this is my own original ideas. I've got this from some amazing communities out there, such as the Therapist Neurodiversity Collective, founded by Julie Roberts. So, but if anybody's looking to find out more, just contact me and I'll just send you like reams and reams of information.
Okay, well, thanks again, Emily, for your presentation this evening. That does conclude our education conference. Thank you to our brilliant guests, Iram, Annie and Emily. Also, thank you to everyone behind the scenes at Tapestry and the Foundation Stage Forum who have been working very hard to put this event together. We hope to see you again next time.